engineering wonder, blasted through granite and ice. In wicked winter weather.
Those bridge builders were something else.
A century-old railroad that survives and thrives.
It's not just a job, it's an adventure.
Thanks to a rare vintage fleet of diesel and steam.
It is a sight to behold.
It's a narrow-gauge railway that crosses mountains, valleys, and an international border as often as 12 times a day. In a fjord on the Alaska Panhandle, winter's almost over. The town of Skagway is waking up. And the White Pass and Yukon Railway is firing up, hustling to get their prized fleet of locomotives up and running for a non-negotiable deadline.
We have about 3 more weeks left before the first cruise ship comes in, and if these things don't run, we don't make money, and it doesn't make people very happy.
When cruise ships come around this bend from May through September, they'll deliver hundreds of thousands of tourists to ride the White Pass and Yukon Route. A historic railroad with a vintage fleet of 19 diesel-electric locomotives, 85 carriages, and a custom-made steam locomotive built in 1947. Right now, in the month of April, Skagway is a quiet little village. But in May, it'll transform into a boomtown. And that's nothing new around here. Almost 120 years ago, gold was found on the other side of the mountains. And because Skagway is the closest seaport, the Klondike gold rush went right through here. The rush for riches made the unthinkable possible. Construction of a railroad from Skagway, Alaska, through the treacherous White Pass, 177 kilometers to Whitehorse, Canada. Today, part of that route is open for day trips, the shortest, a 32-kilometer excursion to the White Pass summit. Other trains cross the border into Canada, as far as Fraser and Bennett, BC, and Carcross in the Yukon. Maintaining this mountain railway is a non-stop commitment. And keeping those rare old locomotives in top hauling form is a huge challenge.
They quit really making parts for these in the 70s and 80s. So we're depleting every little warehouse we can find for these parts.
One of the diesel-electric locomotives just had its pre-season inspection.
We have some plates that are missing when we did our inspection, and to let a train go knowing something's wrong is a huge violation.
He's talking about the wear plates that keep the wheels and axles from shifting too much. But to get to those plates, they have to drop the whole motor assembly. There's a lot happening outside, too. Clearing the track and making it safe for tourist season. It's a huge job. Engineer John Westfall has driven trains up the White Pass for 4 decades. He and conductor Pete Gifford are hooking up a work train to take a snow removal crew into avalanche country, where experts have been keeping a close eye on falling rock and snow.
Well, the number one thing we're looking for is to see if there have been any avalanches occurring, because if we've got avalanches that are actually running, we know that things are unstable right there.
Bill Glued is one of Alaska's top avalanche forecasters.
You can see quite a few of our major avalanche paths. We've got Slippery Rock here, which is a big rock slab that releases snow and ice.
And within 1 kilometer of Slippery Rock, several other slide areas, including one that released a giant pile of snow onto the track last week.
This would be a place where I would need to do some snow pit studies.
The The work crew will ride in the caboose. Bill's bringing along his skis and avalanche kit.
We work our way up to where we left the dozers off last night. And the operators will start pushing snow from there.
The Alco engine, built by Montreal Locomotive Works in the 1960s, pulls work trains and loads of tourists. It has mighty hauling ability, 1,200 horsepower, with a hefty prime mover, the diesel engine that rotates the main generator. It produces enough electricity to power the locomotive's 6 traction motors. The work train has climbed almost 600 meters since it left Skagway, and is close to slippery rock in the area Bill Glued wants to test.
We want a place without too many rocks with a good clean snow slope.
Deep into snow country, the heavy equipment operators are ready for action. One machine moves ahead, plowing a rough path. The other works right in front of the train. Without these guys, there'd still be snow on the track in early May when the first tourists arrive.
We're looking at the end of the track for us at the moment. We can only go as far as they've cleared the track, and this is it. So Brad will slowly keep working ahead, and we'll slowly keep creeping on him. We're getting into the deeper snow, and there may be days where we don't really gain much of any ground at all. They will probably make maybe a quarter of a mile.
Time for Bill to check the stability of the snowpack. He measures out an area the length of his skis with a predetermined width that corrects for his weight, and uses those dimensions to form a cube-shaped test block.
So the first step is to smooth it so we can see the layers. And also as the shovel cuts through, you can hear the sound and you can feel the layers.
Figuring out which layers of the snowpack are hard and soft helps Bill predict how easily snow will shift and slide. Next, he'll try to cause a mini avalanche by jumping on the snow cube, increasing the impact with each jump.
Getting nothing, so we'll try to push it sideways.
The snow is not shifting easily today, and that's a good sign.
So there weren't any weak layers to make slabs. So it's a good result for stability.
There's no immediate avalanche threat at this spot, but that can change quickly at this time of year. Back at the shop, mechanics have extracted the wear plate that keeps wheels and axles in place. All those trips up and down the mountain last season have worn it down to nothing.
This is what's left of the wear plate. This is what it's supposed to look like. The thickness that's from this to this.
They weld on a new wear plate. Another job done on the pre-season checklist. On the other side of the shop, they're fixing damage to the carriages that happened over the winter.
The frame is made out of tubing, and sometime in the winter, water got into the tubing and froze, which pushed all the inside panel towards the outside, so we had to cut them out and replace them.
Upstairs,
Hi, this is Keith from White Pass. I was calling to get an ETA on our prime mover.
electrical supervisor Keith Evans is under pressure. 2 of his locomotives are waiting for overhauled engines, or prime movers. Right now, they're just sitting there, with big holes in their middles. The locomotive's main generators have already been reconditioned, but Keith can't install them before the engines get here, via a barge that only comes up this remote waterway once a week.
If one person doesn't do their job and it misses it, I could be backlogged by a month, waiting for a part to come from Seattle.
A month-long backlog is not an option for Keith. Tourists are arriving in 3 weeks, so he can't afford to have any of his locomotives sitting idle. A month after our first trip to Skagway, Alaska, the steam engine is rolling out of winter storage for a pre-season test run. An 87-kilometer round trip across the Canadian border on the White Pass and Yukon Route. In the shop, there's been progress on the diesel-electric locomotives. This one finally has its engine, also known as the prime mover. It arrived on last week's barge from Seattle.
As you can see, our prime mover is set in place, and next is to set the main generator in. We sent it out this winter to have rebuilt.
Keith has to move quickly because the tourists are here. On this day alone, 4 cruise ships will tie up in Skagway. And by 7 a.m., the first of 8,000 passengers start coming down the gangway to the dock. And for a lot of them, a big part of their Klondike adventure is riding this world-famous train. At the White Pass rail yard, staff have arrived hours earlier to get today's trains ready. They come up with a plan based on cheat sheets that factor in the number of bookings for today's excursions and which equipment is available.
We got a lot to do. And we got about, what, Pete, 3 hours to get it done? Yeah, so we're gonna be racing around.
Pete and Tom set a brisk pace, matching locomotives with carriages, and back them down to the appropriate dock and cruise ship.
Victor, 25 more. Victor, 25.
Meanwhile, up on the mountain, the guy that owns the track right now is Foreman Brian Thompson. He patrols every morning to make sure the line is safe for passenger trains.
This is a rock that just came down a couple days ago, but luckily it didn't hit the tracks.
A rock slide can damage the track, sometimes even rip it out altogether.
A long time ago, this bridge was completely taken out by a rock fall. Just the decking, the ties, and the rail were suspended in the air. It's not just a job, it's an adventure.
No rock fall today. This part of the line is clear. So Brian sends word back to dispatch in Skagway.
U.S. track inspection complete. 2021 will be working between White Pass and Glacier.
Dispatch out.
This will be the crew on my journey today. Engineer John Westfall, who drove the work train last month. Conductor Chris Williams, reading this morning's operating procedure.
Number 21 at White Pass, in care of number 21 at the shops.
And brakeman David Dobbs.
All right, guys, you're good to go.
There will be 10 trains heading out today. Most of them will climb 32 kilometers to the White Pass summit and turn around at the Canadian border. But a couple of trains, including mine, will cross the border and travel another 13 kilometers to Fraser, BC. It'll take us about 2 hours to get there.
Good morning. I'm Kelly. I'm going to be your personal tour guide today. You are aboard a railroad that was built over 100 years ago during the historic Klondike Gold Rush.
Our brakeman, David, does final rounds. And we're off. We're only a few kilometers into our journey, but I'm already seeing this land the way railroad pioneers saw it. Today, the railway is recognized as an international civil engineering landmark. Same category as the Eiffel Tower, the Statue of Liberty, and the Panama Canal. No wonder it's a dream come true for rail fans. Juan came all the way from Chile for the experience.
Well, I can imagine, like, I don't know, in the old days, all this train packed with people, working with, I don't know, with some dream of getting some goal, and I think that's great.
I feel like I'm stepping back in time. I feel like I'm one of the old railroad executives riding my train, you know, checking out the line to make sure everything is perfect.
It's exciting out on the deck, but I also want to find out more about these incredible sights. That's the Skagway River, right?
That is the Skagway River, and there is one section that is a giant whirlpool. It is technical class 6 rapids. A lot of us will use poetic license and tell you that nobody survived navigating the river, but in actuality, nobody's tried to navigate that river.
So I probably shouldn't try.
I would not.
No.
Well, you can be the first. I can tell your story next year.
Oh, yeah. Be a sad ending to the story. After more than 7,000 runs, John Westfall knows every kilometer of track, forward and backward. But he never takes anything for granted, especially going downhill.
The goal is to run the smoothest train that you can, and that's the challenging part. As there's controlling the slack and the speed at the same time, and the changes in the grade.
There's slack between the carriages because of movement in the couplers, springs, and hydraulic systems, adding up to several feet of slack across the length of the train. Going downhill, the engineer has to compensate, making sure the carriages bunch together as gently as possible against the engine. This takes skill and finesse. At the top of the hill, John reduces the throttle to 0 and starts coasting. Then he applies the train's dynamic braking system, which reverses the rotation of the traction motors, while keeping a close eye on the amperage flowing through those motors. He also needs to know exactly when to apply the air brakes on longer hills and heavier trains.
Some days I think I got it down. Other days I don't know.
Back at the rail yard,
Go, Jeremy.
fireman Jeremy Simmons and engineer Jim Hamilton prepare to fire up the 70-year-old steam engine for the first time this year.
You done the valve oil on top?
Yeah, valve oil is good.
And so before we go out for any run, we have to go do our daily inspection, which includes checking all the lubricants.
They've filled the water tender and the fuel tank with thick PS300 fuel oil. When the steam engine is cold, it needs startup help from one of the diesel-electric locomotives. Air from the diesel's compressor will turn the oil in the steam engine from liquid into a fine spray to maximize combustion. It's called atomization.
Once we acquire about 20 pounds of steam on the engine, we're able to shut off the compressor and switch over to steam to atomize the fuel and build a fire.
My train is now starting its first big uphill climb. The steepest parts of the track have a grade of almost 4%, where we gain 1.2 meters of altitude for every 30 meters we move forward, the steepest grade a train can handle without special equipment. So this section of track is called the Highline section, and in addition to this scenery and these massive drops, it's impressive because of the old wooden trestle bridges we'll go over and the tunnels we'll go through, because those bridges and tunnels are from the late 1800s, which makes it even more impressive. And look at this drop. See why it's called the Highline section. Wow. It's incredible that it only took 2 years to carve a railroad out of these mountains. Especially because most of the workers were fortune seekers with zero experience building railroads.
Luckily, our railroad foreman knew that he was working with people that had no experience, so instead of using dynamite, he used blasting powder. It was safer to use, slower burning. It shifts rocks out of the way instead of blowing them to pieces like dynamite.
This rugged stretch has claimed lives. In 1917, an avalanche near Slippery Rock knocked an engine right off the cliff, killing the engineer and fireman, a father and son.
So after that, the railroad had a policy of family members weren't allowed on the same engine at the same time.
Front of the train snaking into that tunnel. That's a tunnel that was built in the late 1800s, along with the original part of this line. And right before it, this amazing wooden trestle bridge. Here we go. This is what it looked like in 1898. They blasted a working ledge into the face of the cliff and built the bridge we just crossed in the dead of winter. The train heads up another hill, nicely stretched out. But suddenly, we've stopped. It can't be to pick up passengers because we're sitting on the edge of a cliff. David, our brakeman, looks puzzled. Turns out John has a very good reason for stopping.
I think I have something on fire.
He's seen smoke coming off an axle. A smoking locomotive is never a good thing. 27 kilometers into our journey on the spectacular White Pass and Yukon Route, we've come to a sudden stop on a steep part of the mountain. Our engineer John and conductor Chris are trying to figure out what's wrong.
He must have smelled something, a gauge goes off or a bell goes off, and he's not real sure what it is, but it's unusual that we did stop.
I'm not seeing anything right now, Chris. I guess I was looking back and I saw smoke, which is never a good sign, and so I stopped. And there's several things that could smoke. Traction motors can burn up.
Traction motors under high strain can cause a serious electrical fire. Located on the train's 6 axles, the traction motors provide propulsion power to the wheels, using electricity generated by the locomotive's engine. The fast-spinning wire inside the traction motors can break and unwind if the motor is overworked. That happens often on a steep mountain railway. So White Pass mechanics overhaul at least a dozen traction motors every season. They're fixing one right now back at the shop.
We had to replace the traction motor due to it's going to what they call going to ground. It had a short in it.
Mechanics Jackie and John are an efficient team, and an unusual one. They don't just work together, they also live together.
Well, we work up here 8 months out of the year, and then we work for another company down in Washington State 4 months out of the year.
So we're on the road together all the time.
They'll have this locomotive back on the track tomorrow. Up on the mountain, our engineer hasn't found any sign of smoke while the locomotive is stopped. John decides to proceed with caution. Chris, the conductor, keeps a close eye on the axle as the train starts up.
There we go. Did you see anything? No, there was a little bit of smoke coming off the #2 traction motor, but it seems to be clearing up.
For now, it's an unsolved mystery. Could have been a bit of excess grease or oil burning off on the axle. But John's not taking anything for granted.
Well, I'll be wary. I won't be my relaxed, cheerful self.
As our train picks up speed again, we're approaching some of the best-known sights and some of the most tragic parts of White Pass history. Amidst this incredible landscape and vista, this area below is actually called Dead Horse Gulch, and it's appropriately named for the thousands of animals and horses that died because of abuse and neglect at the hands of the early gold prospectors. Crossing this gulch also created challenges for the railroad's builders, and it resulted in an engineering wonder. This is the cantilever bridge right here, and we're actually not going to go over it. It was shut down many years ago, but they've kept it here as this incredible historic monument. Look at that. It was decommissioned in the 1970s because it was too light to carry the heavy haul ore trains of that era. But when it was built back in 1901, it was the tallest structure of its kind in the world. Here's the bridge that replaced it. Not as beautiful, but gets the job done. We're closing in on the White Pass summit. The track foreman has arrived ahead of us.
Motorcar 2021 is in the clear at White Pass.
Brian Thompson gives the morning trains approaching White Pass the all clear. 5 of them altogether. The summit is also the border between the US and Canada, marked by a pair of flags on a hill. Now Brian has another important job to do, a roll-by inspection required by law. He's looking for anything out of the ordinary, mechanical issues, or anything dragging, smoking, or caught up in the running gear. There have been thousands of perfect runs for engineer John Westfall over the past 4 decades. But he had one bad day right here at White Pass in 2014.
The worst day I actually had was about 2 years ago. We got to White Pass and the throw rod of the switch had broken. And instead of going up the main, we went up between the 2 tracks.
The engines plowed into the gravel between the tracks and derailed.
Luckily, we had just minor injuries. It was bad. It could have been really bad.
The throw rod that links the switch lever to the movable track was part of an old switch, the only one left on the line. It's since been replaced, and there have been upgrades to other parts of the line. Even though we've crossed the border, we've still got 13 kilometers to go before we get to the actual Canada Customs checkpoint. Back down at the rail yard, the steam engine is coming alive, firing up for that first critical test run of the season. The black smoke comes from oil. The white stuff is steam.
We now have 50 pounds of steam pressure on, so we're going to cut the air supply off from the locomotive and switch it over to steam so it'll be on its own.
At this stage, the steam engine no longer needs help from the diesel-electric locomotive. There are nervous moments whenever an old machine like this is fired up after a long winter's nap. If any part is weak, any joint loose, or any seal broken, it could cause a rupture, and superheated high-pressure steam could escape. Jeremy is hoping that cold oil can heat up quickly enough to give them the power required for the test run.
This is the first time we're running it this year, and so the oil's really cold. So right now we can get our boiler pressure up pretty well, but if that oil's not hot enough when we're up on the hill, we won't be able to maintain track speed like we'd like to.
There's a lot riding on this test run. Rail fans are happy to pay a 20% premium for the steam engine. With thousands of tourists paying $160 a ride, that's a big boost for business. But only if everything checks out today. I'm riding the same rails ridden by tens of thousands of fortune seekers more than a century ago. On the White Pass and Yukon Route, starting in Skagway, Alaska, and heading toward the Klondike in Canada. We've just crossed an international border. We're in northern BC, a couple miles inside the Canadian border. And the landscape, very different. Almost right away when we crossed into northern British Columbia, the topography changed. Trees and plants struggle to survive in this fragile subarctic alpine environment. Another fascinating thing about this spot, the railroad follows an invisible dividing line here. The water on this side of the track drains south to the Pacific Ocean. The water on the other side of the train drains north into the Yukon River. So we've got Lake Bernard right beside us, and here we are, Fraser, British Columbia. This is where we'll clear Canadian customs and where our train turns around. Fraser is a tiny outpost that sits between the railroad and the Klondike Highway. This is what the original Canada Customs Office looked like in 1899. But when you arrive here by train today, the border officers come to us.
Morning, everybody. Morning. Has everybody got their passports open and their pictures? If you've got a Canada visa, could you please find that for us as well?
This must be one of the most unique borders in the country, right?
Well, certainly from a scenery perspective, it is. We're considered an isolated post.
Thank you.
Isolated or not, Trevor and his staff are busy.
Good. How was the train ride? Awesome. Better than hiking up with a backpack? Yeah. It's good.
They process almost 300,000 passengers a year here, about half from these trains.
No bears.
Time to turn the locomotive around for the trip back down to Skagway. John activates the throw rod to direct the engine onto a parallel track and drives past our carriages to hook up at the other end. He also had another look at that axle, and there's no sign of overheating. Seats are flipped, ready to take on new passengers returning from tour bus excursions inland.
Watch your step going up here.
Meanwhile, much further down the track, Engine 73 is quite a sight on her first test run of the season. A short performance trip, hauling carriages without passengers. Running this 70-year-old locomotive requires the full attention of both engineer and fireman. Jim controls the throttle, the brakes, and the amount of steam powering the engine's cylinders. Jeremy controls the fire by adjusting the volume of oil delivered to the firebox. He also controls the boiler's pressure and water level.
So you're always balancing that. If you can kind of find that lovely happy medium where you've got enough fire and enough water getting in there, then it makes the job real easy.
As they cross the trestle bridge and enter that first tunnel, they're still watching closely for any leaks or unfamiliar sounds. My train will be heading back down the mountain, where we'll be stopped in the middle of nowhere by some intrepid travelers. Our brakeman, David, has a lot of new heads to count. Passengers who boarded in Fraser, BC for our trip back to Skagway. This is a great moment to meet some of them. So you're from the Caribbean, you're living in Berkeley temporarily, and now you're up in the wilds of Alaska.
Right.
You're quite a globetrotter.
Right.
What do you think of this railway so far?
I think it's beautiful. Natural beauty is amazing.
Yeah.
The snow, the mountains, the glaciers, it's all amazing.
It's a throwback to the old days. You know, it's unbridled nature in a sense, you know, unvarnished. I mean, it's hard to see this anywhere in the world except here. I mean, they built the railroad through nothing and chopped it out, and look what you see.
We're slowing down.
For some reason, it took them forever to stop.
Someone's hitching a ride. It's a group of snowshoers from one of the cruise ships, along with their local guide.
So we got off the train today, and then they have this station where you gear up, put your pants on, snowshoes, and then kind of trek across the backcountry area.
When we booked our cruise, I wanted to make sure that we were doing something that was very Alaska and very Canadian and kind of connected with the Klondike and connected with the history.
The gold rush history, especially.
So it was really important for us to kind of get back into that history, and then we're outdoorsy, so having this train connect with this adventure was a must.
We've passed the summit. A lot of the journey from here will be downhill. So John engages those dynamic brakes,
Now going dynamics.
reversing the role of the traction motors. Inside the stationary part of the motor, the sequence of rotation of the electromagnetic field changes direction. This forces the rotor, the moving part, to resist against the forward motion of the axle. This process generates huge amounts of power, which could burn up the traction motors in minutes. So excess electricity is fed through a grid and resistors, then released into the air.
So the power they're producing, you can hear that high whine sound. That's they're run through grids, resistors, and blown away as heat.
Right now, John's also getting a little extra help from the back of the train and something called a retainer valve.
We have these retainers here. Sometimes we use them. We're using them right now. Going down the hill, that helps with the braking going down the hill. Keeps our air system up.
When the engineer applies the air brakes, air pressure drops, and the brakes can't be used until it builds up again. But on every carriage, there's a retainer valve that holds back a small amount of air to keep the train's brakes engaged while the system regains pressure. Steam engine 73 has pulled onto a loop near Fraser, the same place it turns around on tourist trips. It's conveniently located near a stream where the water tank is topped up. Jim's busy giving the running gear another blast of hard grease to ensure that these high-friction parts of the steam engine never get too hot.
We got one warm bearing here, but it's not critical, it's warm. Other than that, perfect.
Fireman Jeremy is breathing a lot easier now that the cold start is behind him.
You could tell that the fuel was pretty cold when we first got started, but right around, 10 mile, it started to kind of pick up a bit. Kind of found the sweet spot in there. Even though we were a little worried about how cold it was going to be, it's kind of made up for it now.
And the engineer's verdict?
She ran excellent. We had a great trip, a lot of good repairs done, and we're looking forward to a really good season.
We've just passed the spot where John saw smoke on the trip up. And we've stopped, again. This time we're picking up a pair of skiers. And look who it is.
Hi.
The avalanche guy, Bill Glued, and a buddy. Bill and Denny were working far above the snow line today, at about 1,600 meters above sea level. A few hundred meters higher than we are right now.
So, well, this is probably our final trip up above the tracks, checking the snow for avalanche danger. We've had, 5 days of pretty warm weather now, and sunshine, and the snow has been going through a fairly rapid warm-up, but it's been slow enough that it's been settling in place without too many slides. So we're feeling pretty good.
One less thing to worry about. As White Pass staff race to keep up with what might be the busiest tourist season ever.
All aboard.
We've been riding the rails for almost 4,000 kilometers, all the way from Canada's west coast. And we're closing in on our final destination, Toronto. So, morning number 4 and our second morning in Ontario. We woke up yesterday in the province too. It gives you a sense of the massive scale of this part of Canada. So as we head into Toronto, which is Canada's biggest city, you also really realize how big this province is, but how concentrated the population is in southern Ontario. And it's also the most populated part of the country. I'm basically a train sleeping champion now. I'm sleeping pretty much as I do back at home, getting used to the shakes a little bit. I'm wondering if when I get home it'll feel weird to not have that jostling in the night, because my body's kind of cool with it now. So I've mastered sleeping on a train, but what about train legs? Hey, so Renee, part of the job of a senior service attendant, serving in the dining car.
Yep. So the first thing is you want to kind of spread everything so that it's balanced. So I like putting them all the way around. So for walking, because the train can lurch at any moment, so I like to keep my legs like hip distance or more apart.
Okay.
And my knees are always a little bit bent, so I can really kind of move with the train and absorb.
Be one with the train, right?
Be one with the train. This is my first waiting opportunity, so.
Oh, really?
I hope I can get another job where the building doesn't move.
That would be nice.
That'd be really
great.
nice.
Okay, wish me luck, Renee.
You're right. You'll be good.
All right. Morning, folks. How are you? Water for anyone? Yeah, and obviously when you take the glass off, the tray changes, but that's compounded because of the train movement. How am I doing?
Great.
Really? I love when you lie to me. You're gonna have to share that one, folks. Here we go. Okay, all right. Oh! You guys. Whoa! More water, anyone? As the journey winds down, I can't stop thinking about this incredible experience. Every morning we woke up and it felt like we were in a different land altogether. And I knew that going into this, but it's completely different to see it, especially on a journey like this. And the other thing that I've really got the sense of now on a personal level is how much this railway and this train connects these tiny isolated communities throughout most of the country, and what a lifeline it is for people, and how it must have really helped build this nation. Oh, and it's just also been completely awesome. the Canadian. The only stainless steel streamliner left in North America has completed another 4,500-kilometer cross-country journey. In less than 12 hours, it will turn around and head back westward. The legend rolls on. What a trip.